Before the first cities rose, before the first kings ruled, before iron, bronze, and stone, there was only wilderness. The earth was quiet, untouched by roads, unmarked by borders, just sky, wind, and the wandering steps of our ancestors. This chapter begins not in a palace, but on a sun-baked savanna in what we now call East Africa, where something truly remarkable occurred. A new kind of creature stepped into the light. Homo sapiens, the wise human. But we were not the first. Before us came other humans. Homo habilis, who wielded tools. Homo erectus, who walked upright and tamed fire. Neanderthals, who buried their dead and perhaps loved. But they are gone now. We are the ones who remained. And our story begins humbly. Not with greatness, but with survival. We lived in small, tight-knit groups, maybe 20 to 50 people wandering together. There were no homes, no maps, no leaders. We were hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, tracking herds, foraging berries, sleeping under the stars, surrounded by danger. Every day was a test of wit and luck. But every discovery moved us forward. We made tools, sharp blades chipped from stone, bone needles, wooden spears, simple but powerful. We mastered fire, a turning point so profound it changed everything. Fire gave warmth in cold nights. It kept predators at bay. It allowed us to cook food, unlocking more energy. And more energy meant bigger brains. But perhaps our greatest invention was not a tool. It was language. Language was our magic. With words, we could share memories, warn of danger, tell stories, pass down skills, and imagine. Now we could organize hunts, name stars, mourn the dead. With language, a tribe became a culture, and from culture came civilization. This shift wasn't immediate, but it was unstoppable. Around 70,000 years ago, something changed inside us. Anthropologists call it the cognitive revolution. Suddenly, humans began to draw, to paint, to dream of gods and monsters. In the shadows of caves, we find handprints, painted animals, symbols we still don't fully understand. They lit fires inside dark caverns and painted bison by torchlight. Why? Because we had begun to think beyond the visible world. We believed in things that didn't exist, spirits, myths, ancestors, and that belief, that shared imagination, is the glue of all future societies. But we didn't stay in Africa. Humans are not creatures of stillness. We moved across deserts, rivers, and ice. 60,000 years ago, small bands of sapiens left Africa. They followed the coasts to Arabia, then India, some into China, others into Australia. Later, they reached Europe, where they met the Neanderthals. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they mated. Their genes still echo in many of us. Much, much later, around 15,000 years ago, humans crossed into the Americas, chasing mammoths across frozen land bridges. By 10,000 BCE, we had spread to nearly every corner of the world, except Antarctica. We weren't just animals anymore. We were a force of nature. And yet, the world we lived in was still wild. Cities were unthinkable. There were no kings, no written laws, only memory. Time was told by the moon and stars. The seasons were our only clock. We built temporary shelters of bone, mud, and hide. We followed herds, read the wind, listened to birds. We knew the land like we knew our own hands. It fed us, and sometimes it killed us. There were no prisons, no money, but there was order, held together by storytelling, ritual, and trust. Elders passed on knowledge. Songs taught children about danger. Symbols marked sacred places. Some of us worshipped animals, Some danced under the stars. Some buried the dead with care, laying beads or red ochre beside their skulls. It wasn't civilization yet, but the seeds were there. Then, slowly, the earth began to warm. The Ice Age, which had gripped the world for tens of thousands of years, was ending. Glaciers melted, rivers grew fat, grasslands spread like wildfire, and in these grasslands, something new appeared, something small, but world-changing. Grain, barley, wheat, millet, rice, simple seeds. But they held a secret. If you planted one, it could feed 10. If you saved them, you could survive a hard winter. If you stored them, you could plan for the future. And planning is the birth of civilization. Some humans in fertile places like the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Nile Valley began to settle down just a little. They still hunted, but also planted. They cleared land, watched crops grow, and began to domesticate animals, goats, sheep, cows. And in doing so, they became something else. They became farmers. It was the most radical shift in human history. More than fire, more than tools, because farming led to surplus, and surplus led to settlements. And once people stay in one place, they begin to build. But this change didn't happen overnight. For thousands of years, the world was a mix. Some still roamed as foragers, some farmed tiny plots, some mixed both ways of life. But the path was clear, and from this turning point, everything we now know as human civilization would grow. This was our dawn, not as creatures of the wild, but as architects of the future, before kingdoms, before pyramids, before writing. There was wheat, there was barley, and there were seeds, cradled in the palms of ancient hands, buried in the earth, and left to grow. Around 12,000 years ago, in the warm cradle of a new world, something quietly began to shift. The Ice Age had ended, glaciers retreated, forests expanded, and the rhythm of life began to change. What had once been a world of wanderers was slowly becoming a world of settlers. This was the dawn of agriculture, a revolution not of fire or stone, but of patience, planning, and planting. The human experiment. For tens of thousands of years, humans had roamed in small, mobile bands. We were hunter-gatherers, relying on wild plants, rivers, and the chase. But now, in a few special places, the wild began to be tamed. The Fertile Crescent in what's now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Here, wild grains like emmer wheat and einkorn grew naturally. Humans began to notice which plants were tastiest, which ones were easiest to pick, and, most importantly, where they grew best. Slowly, over generations, we began to plant, then water, then guard. It started as survival. It became strategy, and with it, something extraordinary happened. Humans stopped moving. The birth of settlements from movement came stillness. As people stayed in one place to tend crops, small villages emerged. One of the earliest known, Jericho, in modern-day Palestine, dating back to around 9000 BCE. Protected by a stone wall, it was home to hundreds of people. In Çatalhöyük, Turkey, houses were built wall to wall with no streets. People walked across rooftops, entering through ceiling hatches. There were shrines, art, and family burial plots inside homes. These were not cities as we know them, but they were more than camps. They were the first roots of civilization. Why farming changed everything? Agriculture did more than feed people. It created surplus, more food than a family could eat. And surplus changed the game. Now not everyone had to farm. Some people could become potters, builders, weavers, or spiritual leaders, story keepers, and eventually rulers. Trade began. With more food came population growth. With growth came conflict. And with conflict came the need for order. Society became more complex, more roles, more rules. The seeds planted in the soil were also being planted in our minds. The taming of nature. Alongside crops, humans began to domesticate animals: sheep, goats, pigs, cattle. They provided meat, milk, hides, and power. Oxen pulled plows, dogs guarded homes, cats protected grain stores from mice. For the first time, humans began shaping nature, not just with tools, but with biology. Through selective breeding, we transformed wild beasts into loyal companions, and plants into produce. We were no longer just a part of the ecosystem. We were beginning to control it. Tools, weaving, and pottery, new lifestyles needed new tools. Stone blades became sickles for harvesting grain. Clay pots, used to store food, became essential. We invented looms to weave fibers into cloth. The invention of grindstones for turning wheat into flour marked another leap. People weren't just surviving, they were inventing, building, experimenting. Technology had begun. Spirituality and symbolism agriculture also birthed a new kind of spirituality. Farming depended on rain, sun, and seasons, forces that felt mystical, powerful, divine. Fertility goddesses, harvest festivals, and rituals emerged. Temples were built. Sacrifices were made. In Göbekli Tepe, a sacred site in Turkey built around 9,500 BCE, massive stone pillars were arranged in circles. Carved with animals, symbols, and abstract forms, it's one of the earliest known places of worship. The fact it predates farming by centuries suggests something profound. Belief came before bread. Spirituality may have inspired community, and not the other way around. Trade, time, and the ties that bind with villages came trade. Obsidian from volcanoes, shells from the sea. Goods moved. Ideas moved. People moved. Calendars were invented to track the seasons, vital for planting and harvesting. Time itself became more than the cycle of day and night. It became a tool, a way to organize life. We began to measure, to plan, to count. Society was becoming more structured, more interdependent, and more powerful. The agricultural web agriculture didn't begin in just one place. Around the world, independently, humans began to farm. In China, rice and millet were cultivated near the Yangtze River. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash became staple crops. In the Andes, potatoes and llamas were domesticated. In Africa, sorghum, yams, and coffee emerged. In New Guinea, humans grew taro and bananas. This wasn't a single revolution. It was a global awakening, a double-edged plow. But farming came with a cost. As societies grew, so did inequality. Land ownership created class divides. Surplus led to hoarding, then wealth, then power structures. We see the first signs of patriarchy, the marginalization of certain roles, and the rise of systems that would eventually become kingships, religions, and nations. Farming meant more mouths to feed, and when crops failed, famine followed. When one group had food and another didn't, conflict was born. The Garden of Eden had weeds. The path forward. Yet despite the hardship, the agricultural revolution unlocked something irreversible. It laid the foundation for everything to come. Villages would become cities, tribes would become kingdoms, leaders would become gods, and at the heart of it all was a seed, a small, fragile, buried thing, that somehow grew into civilization.
The unification of Egypt under Narmer had set the stage for one of the most extraordinary civilizations in history. Over the next centuries, the fertile Nile Valley saw villages grow into bustling cities, ruled by increasingly powerful kings, now called pharaohs. These rulers were not just political leaders. They were seen as divine beings, earthly embodiments of the gods, especially Horus, the falcon god of kingship. The lifeblood of Egypt remained the Nile. Its predictable floods brought rich silt, sustaining agriculture and allowing for surpluses. This agricultural abundance gave pharaohs the resources to command vast labor forces and fund ambitious projects. Temples and administrative buildings rose, decorated with vibrant murals that told stories of the gods, the king's victories, and the prosperity of the land. It was in this environment that the first monumental stone structures appeared. Before this time, Egyptian tombs were mastabas, low, flat-roofed buildings made of mud brick. These served as eternal houses for the dead, stocked with food, tools, and treasures to sustain the soul in the afterlife. But one ruler of the third dynasty, Yoser, dreamed of something greater, a structure that would stand for eternity. His architect, Imhotep, revolutionized construction by stacking mastabas into a towering step pyramid at Saqqara. This innovation marked the beginning of the Old Kingdom, sometimes called the Age of the Pyramids. The step pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was part of a vast ceremonial complex, with courtyards, temples, and symbolic gateways, designed to guide the king's soul toward the heavens. This new scale of building required incredible organization. Thousands of skilled workers, not slaves, were mobilized during the Nile's flood season. They were housed in workers' villages, given food and beer rations, and took pride in contributing to their king's eternal resting place. After Yoser's groundbreaking step pyramid, the ambition of Egypt's kings only grew. In the fourth dynasty, the art of pyramid building reached its peak, culminating in the most iconic monuments of the ancient world. The pyramids of Giza, the first and largest, belonged to Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, rising originally to 146 meters. The Great Pyramid was a feat of precision engineering. Over 2 million limestone blocks, some weighing more than 2 tons, were quarried, transported, and fitted with remarkable accuracy. The interior passageways led to the king's chamber, built from massive granite slabs brought from Aswan, nearly 800 kilometers away. Contrary to popular myth, the pyramid was not built by masses of starved slaves. Archaeological evidence reveals that the workforce consisted of skilled laborers, who rotated in and out, supported by a well-organized supply system. They were fed bread, onions, and beer, and lived in nearby settlements. Many workers left behind graffiti proudly claiming their teams built Khufu's horizon. Khufu's successors continued this tradition. His son Udafer built a pyramid at Abu Rawash, though much of it is now lost. Then came Khafre, whose pyramid stands slightly smaller than his father's, but sits on higher ground, creating the illusion of greater height. Khafre is also credited with commissioning the Great Sphinx, a colossal limestone guardian with a lion's body and a human face, possibly modeled after the pharaoh himself. Finally, Menkaure built the smallest of the 3 Giza pyramids, using granite for its lower courses. His reign marked the last great pyramid of this scale, as economic and political pressures began to change royal building projects. Beyond their grandeur, the pyramids symbolized the Egyptians' deep belief in the afterlife. Each pyramid was part of a larger mortuary complex with temples, causeways, and offering chapels. The layout was carefully aligned with celestial bodies. The Great Pyramid sides are oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal points, reflecting the Egyptians' advanced understanding of astronomy. By the end of the 4th dynasty, Egypt had firmly established itself as a superpower. Its rulers commanded wealth, manpower, and technological skill unmatched in the ancient world. Yet, as with all golden ages, this prosperity would eventually face challenges. Environmental shifts, political rivalries, and the immense cost of pyramid construction would usher in a new chapter of Egyptian history. As the Old Kingdom progressed, Egypt's rulers continued to refine the complex relationship between religion, politics, and architecture. Pharaohs were not just kings, they were living gods on earth, the intermediaries between humanity and the divine. This divine kingship justified the immense labor and resources devoted to their burial monuments. The later 5th dynasty marked a shift. While pyramids were still constructed, they were smaller and less precisely built than those of the 4th dynasty. Instead, rulers began to emphasize sun temples in honor of Ra, the sun god, whose cult grew in prominence. The focus of royal ideology shifted from the pharaoh as a sole divine figure to a more complex religious framework that placed Ra at the center. One of the most remarkable innovations of this period was the appearance of the pyramid texts. These were magical spells and hymns inscribed directly onto the walls of royal burial chambers, designed to protect the king in the afterlife and guide his soul to join the gods. These inscriptions give us an unparalleled glimpse into Egyptian beliefs about death, resurrection, and cosmic order. Meanwhile, Egypt's prosperity allowed for the expansion of its administrative system. Powerful viziers managed state affairs, tax collectors ensured a steady flow of resources, and scribes maintained meticulous records on papyrus scrolls. Artisans flourished, creating finely carved statues, painted reliefs, and exquisite jewelry. But such prosperity came at a cost. The resources required to maintain Egypt's monumental projects strained the economy. Local governors, or nomarchs, began amassing their own wealth and influence. This decentralization of power sowed the seeds for political instability. By the close of the Old Kingdom, a series of low Nile floods reduced agricultural output, leading to famine. Coupled with rising tensions between the central government and provincial leaders, Egypt entered a period historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of fragmentation, regional rule, and shifting loyalties. Yet, even in these challenging times, the cultural achievements of the Old Kingdom left an indelible mark on Egyptian civilization. The architectural mastery, religious ideas, and administrative innovations of this era became the foundation upon which future dynasties would build. The next chapter in Egypt's story would not be one of grand pyramids, but of resilience, adaptation, and the gradual restoration of unity, setting the stage for the remarkable Middle Kingdom. The transformation from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers into the builders of vast cities is one of the most remarkable leaps in human history. It began quietly, not with the clang of bronze or the shouts of armies, but with the soft rhythm of planting seeds. Around 10,000 BCE, the first signs of agriculture began to appear in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. This wasn't a sudden revolution, but a gradual shift. Communities that once moved with the seasons now stayed rooted to the land, tending crops of barley, wheat, and lentils. The ability to store food meant that survival no longer hinged entirely on the day's hunt or harvest. This simple act, saving grain for the future, laid the foundation for everything to come. With stability came growth. Villages swelled into small towns. Families expanded. Knowledge could be passed down and built upon, rather than scattered and lost. When people moved on, the first permanent structures began to appear. Not only homes but communal buildings for gatherings, rituals, and trade. Yet, this new way of life was not without its challenges. Farming tied communities to the cycles of nature, in a way hunting never had. A bad season could mean famine. People had to innovate, inventing irrigation systems, studying the stars to predict floods and rains, and creating tools that could till the soil more effectively. The first great centers of civilization emerged in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. Here, water and fertile silt made the land perfect for crops, but the rivers could be unpredictable and violent. This demanded cooperation, entire communities working together to build canals, levees, and reservoirs. Out of necessity, complex leadership structures began to form. It was in these early settlements that humanity's first written records were etched, not for poetry or history at first, but for practical matters, tracking harvests, debts, and trade agreements. The earliest known form of writing, cuneiform, was pressed into clay tablets by the Sumerians. Trade blossomed. What one settlement lacked, another could provide. Stone, metals, and exotic goods flowed between communities, carried by merchants who traveled rivers and overland routes. Along with goods came ideas, new techniques, beliefs, and stories that slowly knit human culture into a web that spanned beyond local boundaries. Religion, too, evolved in these early city-states. Temples rose, not only as places of worship but as the economic and political heart of society. Priests wielded influence equal to that of rulers, claiming divine guidance for decisions that shaped entire populations. The leap from village to city wasn't merely about size, it was about complexity. Laws, infrastructure, culture, and identity began to intertwine, setting humanity on a course toward the great empires yet to come. And at the heart of this transformation was a simple truth. When people stayed in one place, they began to imagine a future, and then they built it. By the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, the settlements of Mesopotamia were no longer just clusters of homes. They had become true city-states, each with its own ruler, patron god, and distinct identity. Urartu, perhaps the most famous of them, was a marvel of its time. Towering walls surrounded its bustling streets. At its center rose the ziggurat, a massive stepped temple, reaching toward the heavens as a bridge between mortals and the divine. Life inside these cities was dynamic. Artisans crafted pottery with intricate designs, smiths shaped copper into tools and weapons, and weavers produced fine textiles that were traded far beyond their walls. The streets were alive with the sounds of bartering merchants, clattering carts, and the constant hum of construction. But the city was more than a collection of buildings. It was an engine of innovation. Writing systems grew more sophisticated, moving beyond simple accounting to record myths, prayers, and epic tales. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, emerged from this era, a reflection of human ambition, friendship, and the search for immortality. With growth came challenges. Resources needed to be managed with precision. The distribution of water for irrigation became a matter of survival, and disputes over land and canals often led to conflict. To keep order, the earliest known codes of law began to emerge, etched into stone so that all could see them. These laws laid the groundwork for governance that would shape societies for millennia. The military became an inseparable part of city life. Soldiers defended the walls from raiders, but they also marched out in search of new territory. As city-states competed for fertile land and access to trade routes, war became a regular part of the political landscape. Victories brought wealth, slaves, and prestige. Defeats could mean total collapse. Still, trade continued to flourish. Mesopotamia lacked many natural resources, so merchants ventured far afield, bringing back timber from Lebanon, gold from Egypt, and precious stones from the Indus Valley. Every new good introduced fresh ideas, and every encounter left its mark on the culture. Religion provided both unity and hierarchy. People believed their city's prosperity depended on the favor of its patron deity, and so temples were not only religious centers but economic powerhouses. They stored surplus grain, organized labor, and even acted as banks. The priests who managed them held immense authority, often rivaling kings. In this vibrant mix of ambition, creativity, and rivalry, the foundation of urban civilization was solidified. People had learned how to live together in large, organized groups, and they would never go back. From here, human society was poised to leap again, from independent cities to sprawling empires. The rise of city-states was only the beginning. As populations swelled and rivalries sharpened, ambitious rulers began to imagine something greater, territories that went beyond a single city's walls. The idea of empire was taking root. One of the first leaders to seize this vision was Sargon of Akkad, a figure wrapped in both history and legend. Around 2334 BCE, he united a patchwork of Mesopotamian city-states under his rule, creating what many historians consider the world's first empire. His rise was no accident. Sargon understood the delicate balance between military might, political alliances, and religious legitimacy. Under Sargon, roads connected distant cities, allowing armies and merchants to travel faster than ever before. His administration standardized weights and measures, making trade more predictable. And through conquest, the Akkadian language spread, becoming a unifying tongue for a diverse population. This was more than political dominance. It was the birth of cultural integration. Yet empires came with their own challenges. Maintaining order over vast lands required bureaucracy, and innovation as important as the wheel or writing. Scribes recorded taxes, census counts, and decrees, while governors enforced the king's will in far-off regions. This structure allowed Sargon's realm to thrive for decades, but also made it vulnerable. When drought struck and resources thinned, rebellion brewed. City-states that had once bowed to Akkad's power began to push back, and invading tribes from the north dealt the final blow. Within a century of its founding, the Akkadian Empire crumbled, leaving behind a warning for future rulers. Conquering is one thing, holding power is another. But even in collapse, the Akkadians left an enduring legacy. Their administrative systems, road networks, and cultural exchanges influenced the civilizations that followed, from the Babylonians to the Assyrians. Each would refine the blueprint of empire, striving to avoid the mistakes of their predecessors while chasing the same dream, unity under one banner. Trade, once limited to nearby regions, now extended across thousands of kilometers. Caravans carried grain, textiles, and metals overland, while ships hugged coastlines, linking Mesopotamia with faraway cultures. With every exchange of goods came an exchange of ideas, religious beliefs, artistic styles, and technological innovations spread with each journey. The story of human civilization was no longer confined to a single river valley. The seeds of interconnectedness had been planted, and history was beginning to weave its first global threads.
As trade routes expanded, the ancient world entered an era of unprecedented connectivity. Among the most famous of these pathways was the precursor to the Silk Road, a loose network of trails and sea passages linking east and west long before the term was coined. Merchants, envoys, and adventurers braved deserts, mountains, and treacherous seas to bring rare goods to foreign markets. From the Persian Gulf to the Indus Valley, from the Levant to Egypt, the movement of resources reshaped economies and societies alike, but goods were only one half of the story. These routes acted as the arteries of cultural diffusion, carrying philosophies, art forms, and even entire systems of governance. A new religious practice might arrive in a distant city through the teachings of a traveling priest. A distinct pottery style could appear thousands of kilometers from its origin after being admired and copied by foreign artisans. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicinal knowledge, once confined to the temples of a single civilization, began to spread to others, creating a foundation for humanity's shared intellectual heritage, yet this interconnectedness was fragile. Empires rose and fell along these trade corridors, and with them, the flow of commerce could flourish or falter. Political stability, the safety of roads, and the willingness of rulers to protect merchants all determined the lifeblood of this system. In some regions, tolls and taxes on caravans became a primary source of state revenue. In others, piracy or nomadic raids threatened to cut entire cities off from vital supplies. The growing complexity of trade required new forms of organization. Cities developed marketplaces large enough to handle goods from multiple regions, while some rulers invested in infrastructure such as paved roads, canals, and way stations. These investments were not acts of charity, they were strategic moves to secure wealth and influence. A kingdom that could reliably offer safe passage for trade. In many ways, these trade networks served as the lifelines of entire civilizations. For coastal cities, maritime trade was especially lucrative. Ships laden with copper ingots, lapis lazuli, and finely woven textiles departed from bustling ports, their sails catching the wind toward foreign shores. Seafaring cultures such as the Phoenicians became legendary for their navigation skills, establishing colonies and trading outposts as far as North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. Each stop was a chance to barter, broker alliances, and gather intelligence about the politics of distant lands. Overland caravans had their own stories. Hundreds of pack animals, often camels, carried goods across deserts and mountain passes. The Silk Road's early segments were not yet the continuous artery it would later become, but even in its fragmented form it knit together the economies of vast regions. The journey was perilous. Sandstorms, bandits, and extreme weather could spell disaster, yet profit drove merchants to risk it all. Trade brought the blending of languages. Multilingual traders acted as interpreters and cultural mediators, negotiating with many peoples. Over time, certain lingua francas emerged, making transactions smoother and trade more consistent. Standardized weights, measures, and coinage began to take hold, laying the groundwork for formal economies. Religion also traveled these routes. Deities worshipped in one land could find temples in another. Myths adapted to suit regional tastes deepened the sense that the world, while vast, was interconnected through shared human experiences. The benefits of this growing network of exchange were immense, but so too were its vulnerabilities. Trade routes were more than conduits for goods, they were also pathways for political influence, espionage, and at times conflict. A merchant's caravan might unknowingly carry not only fine textiles but also seeds of rebellion, letters, coded messages, or even exiled leaders plotting their return. Rulers understood that controlling trade meant controlling power in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. Fortified outposts rose along major routes to protect merchants from bandits and to tax their goods. These levies could make or break the fortunes of cities. Strategic choke points, narrow mountain passes, river crossings, or harbor entrances, became coveted assets fought over by rival states. Whoever held them could set tariffs, dictate terms, and influence the flow of wealth. Travel technology evolved in response. Shipbuilders experimented with stronger hulls for long sea voyages, while overland traders developed sturdier pack saddles for camels and yaks. Navigation improved as sailors learned to read the stars and seasonal winds, enabling journeys to stretch further with greater safety. Alongside goods and technology, disease also traveled. Small outbreaks could devastate communities unaccustomed to foreign pathogens. Though early epidemics were localized, they foreshadowed deadlier pandemics of later centuries. Even so, the lure of trade outweighed the risks. The promise of wealth and exotic wonders kept merchants on the move, ensuring the arteries of commerce pulsed. Artists and craftsmen were deeply affected. A sculptor might adopt foreign styles inspired by artifacts from far lands. A potter's patterns could blend motifs from multiple cultures, creating designs that were the world's first truly international art. These exchanges enriched cultural life but also blurred distinctions between societies, a sign of early globalization taking root. The benefits of this growing network of exchange were immense, but so too were its vulnerabilities. Trade routes were more than conduits for goods, they were also pathways for political influence, espionage, and sometimes conflict. A merchant's caravan might unknowingly carry not only fine textiles but also seeds of rebellion, letters, coded messages, or even exiled leaders plotting their return. Rulers understood that controlling trade meant controlling power. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, fortified outposts sprang up along major routes to protect merchants from bandits and to tax goods. These levies could make or break the fortunes of cities. Strategic choke points, narrow mountain passes, river crossings, or harbor entrances, became coveted assets fought over by rival states. Whoever held them could set tariffs, dictate terms, and control the flow of wealth. Travel technology evolved in response. Shipbuilders experimented with stronger hulls for longer voyages, while overland traders developed sturdier pack saddles for camels and yaks. Navigation improved as sailors learned to read the stars and seasonal winds, enabling journeys to stretch further with greater safety. Alongside goods and technology, disease traveled. Two outbreaks could devastate communities unaccustomed to foreign pathogens. Though early epidemics were localized, they foreshadowed far deadlier pandemics. Even so, the lure of trade outweighed the risks. The promise of wealth and exotic wonders kept merchants moving, ensuring the arteries of commerce remained open. Artists and craftsmen were shaped by this connectivity. A sculptor might adopt foreign styles inspired by artifacts from afar. A potter's patterns could merge motifs from multiple cultures, creating designs that were the world's first truly international art. These exchanges enriched culture but blurred distinctions, a sign of early globalization taking root. As trade flourished, entire cities reshaped themselves to serve as hubs of exchange. Market districts expanded into sprawling labyrinths of stalls and warehouses. The air was thick with the scents of spices, incense, and freshly dyed cloth. Merchants shouted over one another to advertise wares, while porters weaved through crowds with baskets balanced on their backs. In coastal harbors, the creak of wooden ships and the rhythmic slap of waves mixed with the chatter of dockworkers unloading goods from distant lands. These centers became cultural melting pots. Foreign visitors brought not only merchandise but music, stories, and customs. A festival in one city might feature dances from a distant coast, or cuisine flavored with spices grown thousands of kilometers away. People learned to measure wealth not only in gold or grain, but in the diversity of goods and ideas available in their markets. The growing wealth also fueled architectural ambition. Rulers commissioned grand temples, palaces, and public works as displays of power, often funded by taxes on trade. Stone roads were laid to speed caravans, canals were dug to link rivers and improve transport. Each improvement further tightened the web of connections, drawing once isolated peoples into an ever more complex network. but dependence on trade carried risks. A failed harvest in one region could ripple across the network, causing shortages far away. A war that closed a single key route could cripple entire economies. Some rulers hoarded surplus goods as a buffer against these shocks, while others used scarcity as a political weapon, manipulating supply to weaken rivals. Through it all, merchants remained at the heart of the system. They were the lifeblood of this interconnected world, risking fortunes and lives to keep goods and ideas flowing. Their journeys stitched together the distant corners of the ancient world, turning separate civilizations into pieces of a shared human story.
By the twilight of this era, the great web of trade had bound the ancient world into something unprecedented, a fragile, shimmering network where the fate of one city could ripple across continents. A poor harvest in one valley could starve a faraway port. A single war could sever lifelines hundreds of kilometers away. Kings and merchants alike learned that power was no longer measured only in armies or walls, but in the reach of their connections, yet beneath the prosperity, the thread strained. Rival empires eyed each other's trade routes with envy, fortresses were raised on borderlands, and pirates stalked the coasts. Every caravan that vanished, every ship that failed to return, reminded the world that this newfound unity was as vulnerable as it was valuable. In the markets, gold changed hands and treaties were sealed with handshakes, but beyond the city gates, storms gathered. The very roads that carried silks and spices could just as easily carry soldiers and spies. For all its brilliance, this age of exchange had planted seeds of both cooperation and conflict, prosperity and peril, and so, as the ancient world stood more connected than ever before, it also stood on the brink of transformation. The next chapter of history would not be written in the quiet of workshops or the chatter of marketplaces, but in the clash of armies, the fall of cities, and the rise of powers that would shape the course of human civilization for centuries to come. The world's first great empires did not emerge in silence, they rose like storms, gathering power from the very trade routes and alliances forged in earlier centuries. By controlling wealth, they could field larger armies. By holding strategic choke points, they could choke the lifeblood of rivals. In Mesopotamia, city-states once locked in local rivalries were swept into larger dominions. Sargon of Akkad forged the first known empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf deep into the Levant. His conquests were not just military triumphs, they were logistical feats, made possible by the grain, metals, and manpower flowing in from conquered lands. Egypt, too, expanded beyond its river's banks, sending expeditions into Nubia for gold and into the Levant for timber and trade. The pharaohs understood that their monuments and armies alike were built on resources extracted from far beyond their borders. In the Indus Valley, urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro may not have expanded through conquest, but their influence radiated outward through trade and culture, reaching distant lands without ever marching an army there. Yet, the rise of empires came at a cost. Conquered peoples were taxed heavily, their resources drained to fuel the ambitions of distant capitals. Roads were built not only for merchants but for troops, fortresses rose at borderlands not for trade protection but for domination. Still, for a time, this concentration of power brought an age of stability. Merchants could travel under imperial banners without fear, and ideas could spread with unprecedented speed. But history has never known an empire immune to change, and the seeds of decline were already being sown. The decline of an empire rarely happened in a single moment. More often, it was a slow unraveling, driven by forces both internal and external. Trade routes that once fed wealth into the heart of the state could shift, diverting prosperity elsewhere. Climatic changes might reduce harvests, straining food supplies and fueling unrest. Corruption and mismanagement within the bureaucracy could erode public trust, making subjects more receptive to rebellion. Foreign threats were ever present. Nomadic groups, long kept at bay, could seize opportunities to raid or settle in weakened territories. Rival states, watching for signs of vulnerability, might launch calculated invasions. In some cases, the very military strength that once secured an empire's dominance became a double-edged sword, as ambitious generals used their armies to seize power for themselves. Yet even as political structures crumbled, the cultural and technological legacies of these civilizations endured. Ideas, inventions, and artistic traditions outlived the regimes that nurtured them. Written laws influenced distant lands, architectural styles inspired builders centuries later, religious concepts crossed borders and blended with local beliefs. By the end of this era, humanity had taken a decisive step forward. No longer bound to isolated communities or short-lived chiefdoms, people now lived within complex, interconnected societies capable of shaping the world on a grand scale. The rise and fall of these early empires was not an end, but a transformation, one chapter closing so that another could begin. In their ruins lay the foundations for the civilizations to come, and in their stories, the enduring truth that power is never permanent, but the human drive to build, connect, and endure remains eternal.